Hello and welcome back to the Camera Rolling Podcast. I'm your host Ronnie. This is episode 18 and today we're talking about a subject that I've been thinking about for quite a while because I love the particular type of movie that I'm going to be talking about today. But without further ado, let's just get into today's subject. So I think for the most part, when you ask somebody like what their biggest fear is, they will name like something very specific like heights or spiders or even like the dark. But I feel like people sort of overlook the fear of the unknown. One thing that I like in particular about sort of the fear of the unknown is the idea that it is not just a fear of something that we already know why it is scary. Like a fear of sharks may make sense because sharks are dangerous, and from a lot of our human encounters with sharks, they can hurt or maim you. Whereas when you fear something you don't know, it's very much a test of your psychological will. It's also very illuminating because it can tell you a lot about the person, how they react to not knowing or not understanding something. Needless to say, the fear of the unknown really has to do with not understanding. And in order to overcome the fear, more than likely you will have to learn something. And that is why I think movies where the unknown is something that we are searching for throughout the entire movie and have to learn something through are great movies, because in the end we do learn something. And it's always great to walk away from a movie both having a better understanding of something or having the desire to learn more about something. And one of my favorite types of films where you don't know something is when something is out there. Movies specifically with the concept of we are in one place and there is something out there that we don't know about. There's something that is eluding us and it could be inching closer to us. Think of movies like The Mist. If you don't know, The Mist is a Stephen King story, and it has been adapted into, I think, a film and maybe a TV series. I can't remember. But essentially, there's something in the mist, and I think that is a great premise. But I wanted to talk about some of my favorite films that ask these questions about what is out there and how do we explore and learn new things, while also understanding that there is sort of an element of sacrifice involved in trying to understand something, especially when it comes to something dangerous. Now, I will have all of these films as well as more films that are of a similar type or genre on my letterbox. I will have a list. So whenever I tell people that I went to school for film, they usually ask me what my favorite film is, and most of the time, I honestly, if I'm being honest, I really don't know. I've seen so many films, and I have analyzed so many films that I really couldn't tell you what my favorite one is, because there's not a film to me that rises above all of the other ones, but there is one film that I will normally say is probably my favorite, and that is Arrival. So Arrival is a 2016 sort of sci-fi thriller / drama that stars Amy Adams and Jeremy Renner. So in short, the film is about Amy Adams' character. She's a linguist and she gets called into a very special mission, I guess, to help understand what has been happening with this big egg orb-shaped thing that appeared one day on US soil. Essentially, the government, like it does, has taken it upon itself to say, okay, since it's on our soil, we will be the ones to investigate. And what they did by bringing Amy Adams in as a linguist is to help understand what these aliens inside are trying to communicate. So one of the aspects of this film is that there are a bunch of these sort of like alien ship pod type things that have landed around the world. So each of these different countries around the world are trying to communicate and interpret what the aliens want and what they're doing here as quickly as possible. And so by bringing in Amy Adams' character, they are trying to figure out what they should do with these alien pods. Now, obviously, this movie is not sitting in the category of being a scary movie. So when you watch it, it's not this, jump scare after jump scare or creepy aliens coming out to try to attack anyone. Nothing like that. Most of this film centers around not knowing and not understanding what these aliens are trying to get across. I really like this movie though because it's a great insight into how like language functions and how it works and how we interpret language and different, the different meanings behind things that are similar. Because one of the points of contention in this movie is how they interpret the word tool or weapon. It's shown that across the different countries that are interpreting what these aliens are trying to communicate is that they are trying to communicate something about tools or a means or something to use, but there are countries that are interpreting as weapon, which, when you look at that in terms of the connotation, it could mean a weapon against humanity, whereas a tool could just be something that could be helpful or useful and more neutral of a stance. But besides the language aspect of this film, there's also a time element in terms of Amy Adams' character. She had lost a daughter recently, and she ends up striking up this sort of relationship with Jeremy Renner's character, and there's sort of like, a romantic tension between them, and we have all of these different elements playing into her life that we are understanding to be true, but as you get closer to the end of the film, you start to discover that time is not linear, and what is occurring in the story that we know is not necessarily what has or hasn't already occurred. It's definitely one of those films where, like, when a character's asleep, you can't tell if they are remembering something or if the dream is something that hasn't happened or something that's going to happen. There's definitely a lot of play into that, and I think, towards the end of the movie, discovering that time is not linear and that Amy Adams' character is pretty much one of the only people who is understanding what these aliens are saying and trying to communicate because she is having this sort of special connection and they are trying to communicate with her about what is going on, makes it all the more interesting and more complex to me. But you might be wondering, why would you put this on a list of the scary things that are out there? Well, of course, like, the concept of this film has to do with, like, the fear of the unknown and how the government will likely react to a situation like this. Now, personally, I think that most governments that have, like, certain weapons would just immediately start shooting at it. And we would all just be obliterated by the aliens. I don't know about you, but I feel like a lot of our governments kind of like jump immediately into that stuff instead of taking their time to be like, let's interpret what they're saying. Like, let's figure out if we can get a language thing happening here. But more so, that is part of the pressure of this movie. That's part of why it makes this movie scary, because these aliens they're like sort of blackish blob, sort of cephalopod type of things. They're very like creepy in terms of how they look. Like, if you're afraid of spiders and spider-like type of things, definitely on the creepier side. But it's one of those things where when you see something like that, or even see, something like these black and white ink blots that they sort of communicate with, it's one of those things where I think it definitely plays into the idea of like a Rorschach test of like seeing blobs and what people see within them, even if they are technically a neutral thing. And that's the thing that I think is really interesting about this film, is that part of the fear comes from just not knowing what they mean when they are trying to communicate and trying to translate what language these aliens are speaking in. And like I said before, there are people around the world translating these words into weapon, whereas other people are translating it into tools and things like that, where when we are looking at things, the fear is more so a projection of our own ideas. Similarly to how when we see something in the sky, we may immediately call it a UFO carrying aliens because our brain is trying to make sense of what we are seeing, and when it can't, it tries to connect it to the closest thing that we can. And a lot of us very much fear aliens, and so I think in this situation, it's very easy to look at something that is technically just a neutral thing, which is them, showing these ink blots of communication, or seeing something that we personally fear, like a spider, and immediately being afraid when we don't actually know if these aliens are coming in peace and if they are like good beings or beneficial beings. This one is definitely one of the more like psychological something is out there sort of movies rather than a literal something is out there, because yes, technically there's like an aliens aspect of it, like aliens are out there, but I think more of the question of something is out there is more so I'm afraid of something that is out there and we can see it, but we don't know what is going to happen to us and what might already be happening to us. There's definitely an element within films like this. I would say that Annihilation is another film that's sort of similar to this, where we are watching things transform and we really can't do anything about it as we are watching it. And I think this film does a great job of doing that, where we don't realize the things that are changing and the things that are different than when they started until much, much later. Another film that sort of deals with a similar, concept surrounding time and it being linear is In the Tall Grass. Of course, In the Tall Grass is a Stephen King story that has been adapted into a film yet again. And I think Stephen King is always a great place to start when you think of something that is more along the horror that isn't so much graphic in gore, but horror as in very, chilling, very unnerving. And I think that Stephen King does a great job of that, both in his writing, but also I think that there have been a lot of people who have done amazing adaptations of his work. Now, In the Tall Grass is a 2019 Canadian film, but essentially the story follows a pregnant woman and her brother, and they are on a road trip, and they end up stopping in a place, I think, to go to the bathroom or take a break, when they end up hearing this sound of a boy crying from inside this just like enormous land filled with grass. Now, obviously, it's tall grass. It's in the tall grass. So, like, the grass, you cannot see over it. And I think a lot of us sort of have this fear of, like, going into a corn maze and not being able to find our way out. Sort of this idea that something is so tall around us and sort of is muffling the sound of our voice, maybe confusing us, sort of in the way that if you know much about, like, scuba diving and stuff like that, where you can sort of go in there knowing where you want to go and having a plan, and then all of a sudden one little thing happens and you are lost, you are scared, you have no idea which way is up or down, and those two situations are very similar. But essentially the two go into the grass looking for this child who is crying out, and they get lost. They lose each other in the grass, and so they begin to hear this shouting, and it sort of becomes this situation where they start running into different people who are in the grass. And no, it's not like they're just running into like random people, but essentially the brother and sister stumble across the boy and his family. So at different times they encounter different members of his family. So his dad at one point encounters the sister, and the brother encounters the little boy named Tobin, and they are all trying to find each other, sort of trying to get on each other's shoulders to see above the grass, trying to let them know like where they're at. And as they're going along, you'd think if you see like somebody waving above the grass or something like that, that you would be able to go directly towards them. And the scary part of this film is that the grass is not just grass. It sort of has a mind of its own. It's a supernatural type of grass. So as they try to get closer to each other, as they think that they are getting closer to each other, it shifts around. They, 1 minute they're right next to each other, and the next minute they are super far apart. Needless to say, the whole concept is scary in itself. There's a lot of sort of like relationship, sort of, in distress type of plot that goes on with this, in terms of, the pair finding this family who's in disarray, as well as the child plays a very key element in the horror of like, understanding what's going on, but maybe not the adults understanding what's going on and knowing that something is not right here. There's also like this giant rock in the middle that plays a role, and that is creepy as well. I don't know how they managed to make a singular rock one of the creepiest images of this entire film, but it's creepy. But again, one of the truly scary parts about this movie before we really understand what is going on is not understanding what's going on and feeling like there's something out there with you, especially something that is so out of your control. At least when like a serial killer or an axe murderer is like chasing after you, you know exactly what they are, you know that they are coming after you, and you are scared because like, you know, you've got to hide, you got to find your way out, or you've got to figure out a way to fight them off, you know, find out their weakness. But when you are dealing with something that is a supernatural sort of like entity that, you know, can essentially like possess people, take over their sort of mental state and cause, you know, mental and emotional distress, yeah, it's definitely scary, and I would never want to be lost in there. But this film definitely touches on one of my larger fears about like being lost somewhere and not being able to find my way out, or more specifically, knowing that somebody else is out there. Because even if you find your way out of this place, you know that like your sibling is left in there. So like you can't just find your way out and be like, yay, I'm free. Like you have to find everybody else. Another film that falls on my list of something is out there and I'm scared, which this one is more of a physical thing because the ones I've talked about thus far are sort of like, you know, ideas and stuff, but this one is more of a physical one, and this may annoy some people, but A Quiet Place. When I saw A Quiet Place, it quickly rose to be one of my favorite films of all time, not just because the concept is just amazing, and also I love when they have, you know, a disabled character in a film where their disability is not necessarily a hindrance, but it definitely plays a large role in the plot and what's going on, but also because I have sort of a special connection to it in terms of the writers. But if you're not familiar with what the film is about, it's a 2018 film starring John Krasinski and Emily Blunt. Essentially, this film takes place in a world that's sort of post-apocalyptic, but there are these monster-type beings that have really, really good hearing. Thus, everyone, in order to remain safe, must be extremely quiet. And John Krasinski's character and his wife have escaped society in order to build a quiet life out in sort of like a farm type of area. They've sort of, you know, been living out there for a long time, and the problem that they are currently running into is the fact that Emily Blunt's character is pregnant. How do you have a quiet pregnancy? So that is one of like the main issues that we're dealing with, along with some other just like traumatic stuff that happened, obviously, like when the apocalypse first started in losing one of their children, as well as one of their children is deaf, and so part of the issue with that is that when you're deaf, you can't tell how loud you're being, so it can make it sort of difficult in terms of when it comes to high-stakes situations. In order to be quiet, it's hard to know, like, what exactly is making noise, so that, like, becomes an issue at one point, but it's also, like, a great thing at the same time because they can all communicate using sign language, so, like, even if they do have to be quiet and communicate, they can use signing, right? But to circle back to what I was saying about the writers, part of the reason that I really love this film is because the writers actually went to the school that I went to, and they sort of based this idea off of what it's like to be on campus during the summer, because it really is just dead. I remember hearing essentially the statistic that, like, when summer comes, the population of the city is pretty much cut in half because of like how many students take up the campus, especially because the campus is in a central downtown area. It really is just dead during the summer. Like, that's when I actually started going to college there, so it was just really interesting to hear that side of what this film was about, because like, I could literally picture exactly what they were talking about, and, like, it made so much sense to me. After seeing the film, I was like, yeah, if I were bored on campus during the summer, I could see writing something like this. I could see basing something off of that, because that is insane. I think the storytelling, especially in this film, is just amazing. I definitely think that there aren't too many moments where it's like too slow or too fast. They don't give away everything immediately, and there's just so much tension in the film because of how quiet it is. And we also get some perspective audio, at least from when we are sort of seeing things through our deaf character, where things are completely silent. Yeah, I just think this is a very well thought out film, and that's why it's up there with one of my favorites. But obviously the element of something being out there is that these beings are incredibly fast, yet they are, you know, blind, and they are going solely off of what they are hearing, and so it's extremely scary, both because it's the unknown, and we really don't get a lot of understanding about these beings until this film and the second one, that we really understand, like, more about what they are and how they function. And I think that's one of the scariest part about alien monster type of films, where you just don't know what you are dealing with until you've had to have enough casualties and encounters with it to understand it. Because obviously, like, in the beginning they show, like, the day that, you know, they showed up, and, you know, you see a lot of these people screaming and dying and stuff, and it ends up being that, like, you know, they can't really figure out how to stop these beings, because obviously, like, if you're trying to survive in, like, a zombie apocalypse or something like that, like, understanding, like, how to get rid of them, how to, like, defeat them is part of, like, wanting to survive. Otherwise, what is the point of, like, surviving? Is, like, to just live and not know. Either way. But especially, like, when you have the chance with, like, a much larger group of people to, like, figure it out. But then again, like, by the time that they are figuring this out, there's really only tiny, small groups of people who have actually survived. And so, again, it's just a really interesting film to look at, and there's a lot going on with it. And I know, like, the second one, like, definitely wasn't as good as the first one, but the concept is so strong. I love it. The next film is, in my opinion, sort of an underrated gem. It's not so much that it's, like, completely unknown. I just think it's kind of underrated, because I love me a good The Ocean Scary movie. And that's what this next movie is, Sea Fever. So Sea Fever is a 2019 Irish film starring Hermione Corfield and Dougray Scott and Connie Nielsen. So essentially, this sort of quiet and reserved PhD student, Siobhan, is going on this boat expedition with some other people, and she's pretty much there to study. And it's one of those things where, like, I think, like, with her degree and whatnot, that she's, like, supposed to go on some sort of, like, work site, experience or something like that. But essentially, she's put aboard a fishing trawler with this group of people that she really just doesn't know. Like, she clearly did not want to be around people. Like, she's not very, she's just very, like, shy and sort of to herself. Whereas these people don't like her because she's got red hair. But essentially, they believe that her red hair is going to make them unlucky, that they're gonna have problems. And unfortunately, it is true that they have problems, but I really don't think it's because of her. Honestly, if they would have listened to her, they might have had less. So with the group of them, they go out onto the sea, and of course, weird things start happening when they enter this place called the exclusion zone, i.e. a place they are not supposed to be. They are not supposed to gather any fish from that area. And of course, they begin encountering a lot of problems. At first, it's like sort of this barnacle issue that's happening on the outside. We end up with Siobhan sort of going out there trying to, like, get at it and trying to get it off of the boat, and again, just more problems start to occur, and it starts to seem like some people are getting sick, but they start to encounter some weird stuff, and then the guy who was kind of like pushing them to go out of their way to this location that they shouldn't, he sees this squid and he's like, oh, like we should follow it because it's giant squid, and like we gotta get that, right? Like this will bring us in a lot of money. And even though he is not the captain is like, yeah, okay, fine, like you know what you're doing, so like we will go after it. Like she's too nice to her husband. She needs a lot, not listen to him. But as they are following the squid and as like more weird stuff starts to happen, it seems like something is not right here. Now, Siobhan is the kind of person who seems like very reasonable. So she's like, well, clearly there is some kind of disease or something happening here, like something is not right. Whereas everyone else is sort of like, they're getting sea fever, which is sort of this idea of like sort of entering like a psychosis from being on the ocean or being on the water for extended periods of time. They especially think that this happened to a crew that they find aboard sort of this abandoned ship. Like, they see the ship and they're like, okay, like, you know, somebody else is stuck out here, maybe they can help us. But when they sort of enter, they find that everyone is gone by their own accord, and it seems like they may have succumbed to sea fever. And as they get back to their own boat, it seems that more things are going awry. It seems like more people are having, like, issues with their health, you know, falling, you know, under the weather. Either way, it kind of becomes almost the Thing situation where they are sort of checking each other, trying to figure it out. And of course, Siobhan is like the main person who's like, okay, like I think I can sort of figure out like what might be the first signs of something happening. And so she's sort of checking everyone out, and they're like all mad about it. And she's like, well, like, we cannot return because there's clearly an infection happening here and we don't want to spread it to everyone. And they're like, no, we got to get to the hospital to save ourselves. And she's like, literally started puking me, like. But yeah, it's a really great story, and of course, again, I love this sort of like idea that like something is not right, and of course by the time they figure it out, it's already too late. It's definitely scary if you are someone who's like scared by the ocean, because it's not so much that there's like a giant entity, you know, that's gonna go get them, so much as it is sort of a almost like Bermuda Triangle situation where things start to go awry, and it seems like people are succumbing to their own psychosis. The final film that I want to talk about that I really like that's sort of in this genre is one that I've actually talked about, I think, before, when I talked about my recent watches way back when, but it is The Broken. The Broken is a 2008 French-British film starring, who is it, Lena Headey, and directed by Sean Ellis. This is one of those films that really stuck with me after it. One, because it deals with doppelgangers, and that always sticks with me because, I don't know, man, that kind of scares me. But the other reason that this stuck with me was because it was so well done, and by the end, I definitely needed to watch it a second or third time to really understand what was going on, or at least look up on Reddit to see, like, who knew what was going on, because there was a lot that felt like it was left unsaid, but at the same time, it concluded very well. But essentially, this story follows a regular gal, Gina. She's doing what she does. She goes to work, she, you know, has a good job, she has a boyfriend, she, you know, just celebrated her father's birthday along with her brother, and yeah, everything seems pretty normal. It's definitely a very, like, cold movie, so, like, when you first enter the movie, it definitely feels very, like, yeah, like, the color grading on it definitely gives you sort of an already sort of cold and detached feeling. But at the beginning, we see her family celebrate her dad's birthday, and there's this giant mirror that smashes to the ground in the middle of it, and they all just kind of write it off. But after that, we get a very important sequence that changes like the course of the film and just sort of our understanding of what's going on. When Gina goes to work the next day, like, she gets told that by her coworker that they thought they just saw her walking out of the building going home, and she's like, no, I've been here the whole time. And as she starts to make her way home, she is walking and she sees a woman who looks just like her. So, like a crazy person, because I feel like if I saw someone who looked like just like me, I would run up to them and be like, we look alike, you know what I mean? Or I would just ignore it. I would just be like, oh, they kind of look like me, and then I would like leave it alone. But no, she follows her up to her apartment and everything, and she goes into her apartment because this woman seems to just like leave things open, I guess. But she sees a photo of herself and her father, and that freaks her out. So she runs out of this woman's apartment, and as she's running back and getting in her car to go home, she sees this woman out again. And as she's looking at this woman, she ends up in a car accident, and when she wakes up, she is very confused. Essentially, she wakes up with no memory of the accident, so a lot of the film is her trying to figure out what exactly happened and getting these different, I guess, clips or pieces of the memory coming back to her, and her trying to figure out what all of this means, like if it was a dream, if it was even real, right? At the same time, everyone in her life is acting very strangely, and it doesn't help that even when she goes to talk to a therapist, psychiatrist, I'm not really sure exactly what it is, but a mental health professional, that he doesn't really believe her. Like, it's very much like you might want to just take some medication, like, maybe, like, pop a Valium. But it seems like people are acting very strangely. Not only, like, the people that she knows that are closest to her, like her boyfriend, but also the neighbors, and just other people in her life that she seems to encounter that, were acting one way but are now acting very different. Now, for a spoiler, I guess, like, I'm just warning you now, that essentially what she ends up finding out is that there are, like, people, doppelgangers, behind the mirrors, and when these mirrors have been broken, it sort of, like, releases them. And so these doppelgangers are essentially out to get them. But it's definitely a really creepy, like, trying to figure out, like, who you are, yourself, as well as, like, this sense of amnesia. Like, one of my, I guess, biggest fears is something along the lines of amnesia, dementia, or just losing my memory, because that's a very scary experience. If you know anyone who's been through that, you know that, like, they are constantly struggling to feel safe in their environment because they don't know where they're at, or they don't know who they're talking to, and that's very scary. And so not only that being, like, a scary element of this film, but also just, like, the psychological twists and turns that this film takes. But again, this is another one of those things where, like, it's not just, like, a psychological thriller where we can't tell, like, who's lying or, like, if it's a dream or not. It's not just that. Like, there is actually something more sinister happening here, and it makes it all the more scary. And again, this isn't necessarily a film that is, like, something is out there or it's on the other side of, like, the wall or something. Like, it's not like The Mist where there genuinely are, like, creatures out there. But it's definitely a fear of a doppelganger. The fear that you are replaceable, the fear of, like, losing your memory, the fear of, like, change in general. Like, it's definitely a really freaky concept to walk away from a film thinking about, because, like, obviously, like, if you're someone who's, like, rational, you probably don't believe in a lot of this stuff that's going on, but it would still be extremely scary to encounter this, and it's extremely scary to think about. Again, these movies aren't necessarily, like, creepy, horror, scary, in your face type of films. A lot of these movies are very subtle in their use of the unknown, A lot of these films particularly made this list because they do deal with the unknown of something being out there that is beyond us that we don't have control over. Whether there is something out there out of our control of like doppelgangers or of, the ocean in general, of monsters that have very specific abilities that we can't learn about until we've encountered them and, lost lives, or if it is something supernatural that can take hold of someone's, psyche, or if it's just the unknown of not understanding and not being able to decipher the intentions of something or someone that we don't know very well. But I think all of these films play into that idea that when there's something out there that we don't understand, that we are now encountering, we have to make choices about what we will do moving forward, whether we're going to let our fear lead us to violence, or if we are going to be patient and try to collect insight and evidence as to what we should do moving forward. It's definitely scary to experience something new, and the line between the feeling of saying there is, we could do something new or we could experience something new versus there's something out there and we are going to encounter it are very, the line is very fine between the difference in those two statements, and it really has to do a lot with the language that we use and also just the situation. In a lot of these situations, they just found out too late what exactly was going on, but at the same time, a lot of the people who were surviving were the people who were taking their time and being patient to sort of observe before they really decided on any particular action. And again, that's why I like this sort of psychological test, I guess, that comes from films like this, where you really have to, sit there and ask yourself and ask the people around you, what would you do? And in the moment, you may think, oh, just go through the door. But then when they do, it was the completely wrong decision, and you realize that when you don't know something, neither decision is the right decision sometimes. But yeah, these weren't necessarily scary films, just films that have some sort of psychological element that involves thinking about what's out there and what you would do if you had to encounter something that you knew nothing about. But that is all that I have for you guys for this week. Definitely let me know down below in the comments what your thoughts were, both on these films and about this type of film, as well as this sort of format of me talking about a specific subject and giving you examples of films that sort of fit within that, category or the topic of it, instead of just discussing one film that represents it in full. And also let me know what you think about these longer episodes where I sort of go on for a little bit longer instead of talking for closer to 30 minutes. Definitely just trying new things out this year to see what you guys are interested in, so definitely let me know down below. But with that, keep watching movies, and I'll see you guys in the next one.